Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the book reading sessions. So, for those of us just joining now, or those checking out on the YouTube archives, this is the second part of a single session. We finished up the first book, which was Pawn of Prophecy, first book of the Belgariad by David Eddings, which took us maybe 4 sessions, I think it's taken us to get through that. And the beginning part of the session was about an hour and a half that we read the end of that. But it's early yet, and my voice still feels like it's in good shape, and folks are still kind of hanging out and wanting to hear more. So I'm going to be starting into book 2, which is Queen of Sorcery. It's probably not going to be a huge session for the first part of this book. I'm going to need to figure out dinner stuff pretty shortly, but give you at least a taste of it, a couple of chapters. So, Book 2 of the Belgariad, Queen of Sorcery by David Eddings. Prologue. Being an account of the Battle of the Kingdoms of the West against the most heinous invasion and evil of Kaltorak, based on the Battle of Mimbre. In the youth of the world, the evil god Torak stole the orb of Aldur and fled seeking dominion. The orb resisted, and its fire maimed him with a dreadful burning, but he would not give it up, for it was precious to him. Then Belgarath, a sorcerer and disciple of the god Aldur, led forth the king of the Alorans and his 3 sons, and they reclaimed the orb from the iron tower of Torak. Torak sought to pursue, but the wrath of the orb repelled him and drove him back. Belgarath set Sherrick and his sons to be kings over 4 great kingdoms, in eternal guard against Torak. The orb he gave to Riva to keep, saying that so long as a descendant of Riva held the orb, the West would be safe. Century followed century with no menace from Torak, until the spring of 4865, when Drasnia was invaded by a vast horde of Nadrax, Thulls, and Murgos. In the center of this sea of Angarax was born the huge iron pavilion of the one called Kaltorak, which means king and god. Cities and villages were razed and burned, for Kaltorak came to destroy, not to conquer. Those of the people who lived were given to the steel-masked Grolem priests for sacrifice in the unspeakable rites of the Angarax. None survived save those who fled to Algaria or were taken from the mouth of the Elder River by Sherrick warships. Next the horde struck south at Algaria, but there they found no cities. The nomadic Algarian horsemen fell back before them, then struck in vicious hit-and-run attacks. The traditional seat of the Algarian kings was the Stronghold, a man-made mountain with stone walls 30 feet thick. Against this the Angarax hurled themselves in vain before settling down to besiege the place. The siege lasted for 8 futile years. This gave the West time to mobilize and prepare. The generals gathered at the Imperial War College in Tol Honeth and planned their strategy. National differences were set aside, and Brand, the warder of Riva, was chosen to have full command. With him came 2 strange advisors, an ancient but vigorous man who claimed knowledge even of the Angarat kingdoms, and a strikingly handsome woman with a silver lock at her brow and an imperious manner. To these Brand listened, and to them he paid almost deferential respect. In the late spring of 4875, Kaltorak abandoned his siege and turned west towards the sea, pursued still by Algar horsemen. In the mountains, the Ulgos came forth from their caverns by night and wreaked fearful slaughter on the sleeping Angarax. But still were the forces of Kaltorak beyond counting. After a pause to regroup, the host proceeded down the valley of the river Erend toward the city of Mimbre, destroying all in its path. Early in the summer, the Angarax deployed for the assault upon the city. On the 3rd day of the battle, a horn was heard to blow 3 times. Then the gates of Mimbre opened, and the Mimbrate knights charged out to fall upon the front of the Angarak horde, the iron-shod hooves of their chargers trampling living and dead. From the left came Algar cavalry, Drasnian pikemen, and veiled Algo irregulars, and from the right came the Sherrick berserks and the legions of Tolnadra. Attacked on 3 sides, Kaltorak committed his reserves. It was then that the grey-clad Rivens, the Cendars, and the Asturian archers came upon his forces from the rear. The Angarax began to fall like mown wheat, and were overcome by confusion. Then the apostate, Zidar the sorcerer, went in haste to the black iron pavilion from which Kaltorok had not yet emerged. And so to the accursed one he said, Lord, thine enemies have thee surrounded in great numbers, yea, even the grey Rivens have come in their numbers to cast defiance at thy might. Kaltorok arised in anger and declared, I will come forth, that the false keepers of Cathrag Gaska, the jewel which was mine, shall see me and no fear of me. Send to me my kings. Great lord, Zidar told him, thy kings are no more. The battle hath claimed their lives, and those of a multitude of thy Grollan priests as well. Kaltorok's wrath grew at those words, and fire spat from his right eye, and from the eye that was not. He ordered his servants to bind his shield to the arm on which he had no hand, and he took up his dread black sword. With this he went forth to do battle. Then there came a cry from the midst of the Rivens, saying, In the name of Balar I defy thee, Torak. In the name of Aldur I cast my despite in thy teeth. Let the bloodshed be abated, and I will meet thee to decide the battle. I am Brand, warden of Riva. Meet me, or take thy stinking host away, and come no more against the kingdoms of the west. Kaltorok strode apart from the host and cried, Where is he who dares to pit his mortal flesh against the king of the world? Behold, I am Torak, king of kings and lord of lords. I will destroy this loud-voiced Riven. Mine enemies shall perish, and Cathrag Yaska will be mine again. Brand stood forth. He bore a mighty sword and a shield muffled with cloth. A grizzled wolf marched at his side, and a snowy owl hovered over his head. Brand said, I am Brand, and I will contend with thee, foul and misshapen Torak. When Torak saw the wolf, he said, Begone, Belgariad, flee if thou wouldst save thy life. And to the owl he said, Abjure thy father, Polgara, and worship me. I will wed thee and make thee queen of the world. But the wolf howled defiance, and the owl screeched her scorn. Torak raised his sword and smote down upon the shield of Brand. Long they fought, and many and grievous were the wounds they struck. Those who stood near enough to see them were amazed. The fury of Torak grew great, and his sword battered the shield of Brand until the warder fell back before the onslaught of the accursed one. Then the wolf howled and the owl shrieked in one voice together, and the strength of Brand was renewed. With a single motion, the Riven warder unveiled his shield, in the center of which stood a round jewel, in size and like the heart of a child. As Torak gazed upon it, the stone began to glow and flame. The accursed one drew back from it. He dropped his shield and sword and raised his arms before his face to ward away the dread fire of the stone. Brand struck, and his sword pierced Torak's visor to strike into the eye that was not and plunge into the accursed one's head. Torak fell back and gave a great cry. He plucked out the sword and threw off his helmet. Those who watched recoiled in horror, for his face was scarred by some great fire and was horrible to behold. Weeping blood, Torak cried out again as he beheld the jewel which he had named Cathrag Yaska, and for which he had brought the war to the west. Then he collapsed, and the earth resounded with his fall. A great cry went up from the host of the Angarax when they saw what had befallen Kaltorok, and they sought to flee in their panic. But the armies of the west pursued them and slew them, so that when the smoky dawn broke on the fourth day, the host was no more. Brand asked that the body of the accursed one be brought to him, that he might behold him who would be king of all the world. But the body was not to be found. In the night, Zidar the sorcerer had cast an enchantment, and passed unseen through the armies of the west, bearing away the one he'd chosen as master. Then Brand took counsel with his advisers, and Belgariad said to him, Torak is not dead, he only sleeps, for he's a god and cannot be slain by any mortal weapon. When will he awaken? Brand asked. I must prepare the west against his return. Polgara answered, When once again a king of Riva's line sits on the northern throne, the dark god will waken and do war with him. Brand frowned, saying, But that's never, for all knew that the last... Brand frowned then, saying, But that is never, for all know that the last Riven king had been slain with his family in 4002 by Nyasan assassins. Again the woman spoke. In the fullness of time the Riven king will rise to claim his own, as the ancient prophecy foretells. More cannot be said. Brand was content and set his armies to cleaning the battlefield of the wreckage of the Angarax, And when that was finished, the kings of the west gathered before the city of Mimbre and held council. Many were the voices raised in praise of Brand. Soon men began crying that Brand should henceforth be chosen as ruler of all the west. Only Murgan, ambassador of Imperial Tolnadra, protested in the name of the Emperor Ranbarun IV. Brand refused the honour, and the proposal was dropped, so that there was again peace among those assembled in council. But in return for peace, a demand was made of Tolnadra. The Gorim of the Elgos spoke first in a loud voice. In fulfillment of the prophecy, there must be promised a princess of Tolnadra to be wife unto the Riven King, who will come to save the world. This the gods require of us. Again Murgan protested. The hall of the Riven King is empty and desolate. No king sits upon the Riven throne. How may a princess of Imperial Tolnadra be wed with a phantom? Then the woman who was Polgara replied, The Riven King will return to assume his throne and claim his bride. From this day forward, therefore, each princess of Imperial Tolnadra shall present herself in the hall of the Riven King upon her 16th birthday. She shall be clad in her wedding gown and shall abide there for 3 days against the coming of the king. If he comes not to claim her, then she shall be free to return to her father for whatever he may decree for her. Murgan cried out, All Tolnadra shall rise up against this indignity. No, it shall not be. The wise Gorim of the Elgos spoke again. Tell your emperor that this is the will of the gods. Tell him also that in the day that Tolnadra fails in this, the west shall rise against him and scatter the sons of Nedra to the winds and pull down the might of the empire, until Imperial Tolnadra is no more. At that, seeing that the might of the armies before him, the ambassador submitted to the matter. All then agreed and were bound to it. When that was done, the nobles of strife-torn Erendia came to Brand, saying, The king of the Mimbrates is dead, and the duke of the Asturians also. Who now shall rule us? For 2,000 years has war between Mimbre and Asturia rent fair Erendia. How may we become one people again? Brand considered. Who is heir to the Mimbrate throne? Corodolin is crown prince of the Mimbrates, the nobles replied. And to whom descends the Asturian line? Mea Serana is the daughter of the Asturian duke, they told him. Brand said, Bring them to me. And when they were brought before Brand, he said to them, The bloodshed between Mimbre and Asturia must end. Therefore it is my will that you be wed to each other, and that the houses which have so long warred shall thus be joined. The two cried out against the judgment, for they were filled with the ancient enmity and with the pride of their separate lines. But Belgariad took Corodolin aside and spoke in private with him, and Polgara withdrew Mea Serana to a separate place, and was long in converse with her. No man learned then or later what was said to the two young people, but when they returned to where Brand waited, Mea Serana and Corodolin were content that they should be wed. And this was the final act of the council that met after the battle of Mimbre. Brand spoke to all the kings and nobles one final time before departing for the north. Much has been wrought here that is good and shall endure. Behold, we've met together against the Angaracs, and they have been overthrown. Evil Torek is quelled, and the covenant that we have made here among us prepares the west for the day of the prophecy when the Riven King shall return. And Torek will awake from his long sleep to contend again for the empire and dominion. All that may be done in this day to prepare for the great and final war has been done. We can do no more. And here, perchance, the wounds of Erendia have been healed, and the strife of more than 2,000 years may see its end. So far as may be, I am content with it all. Hail then, and farewell. He turned from them then, and rode north, with the grizzled man who was Belgarath and the queenly woman who was Polgara by his side. They took ship in Kamar and Sindaria and set sail for Riva, and Brand returned no more to the kingdoms of the west. But of his companions are many tales told, and of that telling what may be true and what false few men may know. Thus begins Part 1, Erendia. And there is a map. I don't know how well any of you can make that out, but a map of Erendia. Chapter 1. Voasun was no more. 24 centuries had passed since the city of the Wasite Erins had been laid waste, and the dark, endless forests of northern Erendia had reclaimed the ruins. Broken walls had toppled and been swallowed up in the moss and wet brown bracken of the forest floor, and only the shattered stumps of the once proud towers mouldered among the trees, to mark the place where Voasun had stood. Sodden snow blanketed the mist-shrouded ruins, and trickles of water ran down the faces of ancient stones like tears. Garion wandered alone down the tree-choked avenues of the dead city, his stout grey wool cloak drawn tight against the chill, and his thoughts as mournful as the weeping stones around him. Faldor's farm with its green, sun-drenched fields was so far behind them that it seemed lost in a kind of receding haze, and he was desperately homesick. No matter how hard he tried to hold on to them, details kept escaping him. The rich smells of Aunt Paul's kitchen were only a faint memory. The ring of Dernick's hammer in the smithy faded like the dying echo of the last note of a bell, and the sharp, clear faces of his playmates wavered in his remembrance of them, until he could no longer be sure that he would recognize even them. His childhood was slipping away, and try though he might, he couldn't hold on to it. Everything was changing. That was the whole problem. The core of his life, the rock upon which his childhood had been built, had always been Aunt Paul. In the simple world of Faldor's farm, she'd been Mistress Paul, the cook, but in the world beyond Faldor's gate, she was Polgara the sorceress, who had watched the passage of 4 millennia with a purpose beyond mortal comprehension. And Mr. Wolf, the old vagabond storyteller, had also changed. Garion knew now that his old friend was in fact his great-great-grandfather, with an infinite number of additional greats added on for good measure, but that behind that roguish old face there had always been the steady gaze of Belgariad the sorcerer, who had watched and waited as he had looked upon the folly of men and gods for 7,000 years. Garion sighed and trudged on through the fog. Their very names were unsettling. Garion had never wanted to believe in sorcery or magic or witchcraft. Such things were unnatural, and they violated his notion of solid, sensible reality. But too many things had happened to allow him to hold on to his comfortable skepticism any longer. In a single shattering instant, the last vestiges of his doubt had been swept away. As he had watched with stunned disbelief, Aunt Paul had erased the milky stains from the eyes of Marche the witch, with a gesture and a single word, restoring the mad woman's sight and removing her power to see into the future with a brutal even-handedness. Garion shuddered at the memory of Marche's despairing wail. That cry somehow marked the point at which the world had become less solid, less sensible, and infinitely less safe. Uprooted from the only place he'd ever known, unsure of the identities of the two people closest to him, and with his whole conception of the difference between the possible and the impossible destroyed, Garion found himself committed to a strange pilgrimage. He had no idea what they were doing in this shattered city swallowed up in the trees, and not the faintest idea where they would go when they left. The only certainty that remained to him was this single grim thought to which he now clung. Somewhere in the world there was a man who crept through the pre-dawn darkness to a small house in a forgotten village and had murdered Garion's parents. If it took him the rest of his life, Garion was going to find that man, and when he found him, he was going to kill him. There was something strangely comforting in that one solid fact. He carefully climbed out over the rubble of a house that had fallen outward into the street, and continued his gloomy exploration of the ruined city. There was really nothing to see. The patient centuries had erased nearly all of what war had left behind, and slushy snow and thick fog hid even those last remaining traces. Garion sighed again and began to retrace his steps toward the mouldering stump of the tower where they'd all spent the previous night. As he approached, he saw Mr. Wolf and Aunt Paul standing together some distance from the ruined tower, talking quietly. The old man's rust-colored hood was turned up, and Aunt Paul's blue cloak was drawn about her. There was a look of timeless regret on her face as she looked out at the foggy ruins. Her long, dark hair spilled down her back, and the single white lock at her brow seemed paler than the snow at her feet. "There he is now," Mr. Wolf said to her as Garion approached them. She nodded and looked gravely at Garion. "Where have you been?" she asked. "No place," Garion replied. "I was thinking, that's all." "I see you've managed to soak your feet." Garion lifted one of his sodden brown boots and looked down at the muddy slush clinging to it. "The snow's wetter than I thought," he apologized. "Does wearing that thing really make you feel better?" Mr. Wolf asked, pointing at the sword Garion always wore now. "Everybody keeps saying how dangerous Orendia is," Garion explained. "Besides, I need to get used to it." He shifted the creaking new leather sword belt around his... He shifted the creaking new leather sword belt around until the wire-framed hilt was not so obvious. The sword had been an Aristide present from Barrack. one of the several gifts he'd received when the holiday passed when they were at sea. "It doesn't really suit you, you know," the old man told him somewhat disapprovingly. "Leave him alone, father," Aunt Paul said almost absently. "It's his after all, and he can wear it if he likes." "Shouldn't Hedar be here by now?" Garion asked, wanting to change the subject. "He may have run into deep snow in the mountains of Sendaria," Wolf replied. "He'll be here. Hedar's very dependable." "I don't see why we couldn't just buy horses in Kamar." "They wouldn't have been as good," Mr. Wolf answered, scratching at a short white beard. "We've got a long way to go, and I don't want to have to worry about a horse foundering under me somewhere along the way. It's a lot better to take a little time now than to lose more time later." Garion reached back and rubbed at his neck where the chain of the curiously carved silver amulet Wolf and Aunt Paul had given him for Aristide had chafed his skin. "Don't worry at it, dear," Aunt Paul told him. "I wish you'd let me wear it outside my clothes," he complained. "Nobody can see it under my tunic." "It has to be next to your skin." "It's not very comfortable. It looks nice enough, I suppose, but sometimes it seems cold and other times it's hot, and once in a while it seems to be awfully heavy. The chain keeps rubbing at my neck. I guess I'm not used to ornaments." "It's not entirely an ornament, dear," she told him. "You'll get used to it in time." Wolf laughed. "Maybe it'll make you feel better to know that it took your aunt 10 years to get used to hers. I was forever telling her to put it back on." "I don't know that we need to go into that just now, father," Aunt Paul answered coolly. "Do you have one too?" Garion asked the old man, suddenly curious about it. "Of course." "Does it mean something that we all wear them?" "It's a family custom, Garion," Aunt Paul told him in a tone that ended the discussion. The fog eddied around them in a chill, damp breeze, chill, damp breeze briefly swirled through the ruins. Garion sighed. "I wish Hedar would get here. I'd like to get away from this place. It's like a graveyard." "It wasn't always this way," Aunt Paul said very quietly. "What was it like?" "I was happy here. The walls were high, and the towers soared. We all thought it would last forever." She pointed toward a rank patch of winter-brown brambles creeping across the broken stones. "Over there was a flower-filled garden where ladies in pale yellow dresses used to sit while young men sang to them from beyond the garden wall. The voices of the young men were very sweet, and the ladies would sigh and throw bright red roses over the wall to them. And down that avenue was a marble-paved square where the old men met to talk of forgotten wars and long-gone companions. Beyond that there was a house with a terrace where I used to sit with friends. In the evening and watch the stars come out, while a boy brought us chilled fruit, and the nightingales sang as if their hearts were breaking." Her voice drifted off into silence. "But then the Asturians came," she went on, "and there was a different note then. You'd be surprised how little time it takes to tear down something that took 1,000 years to build." "Don't worry at it, Paul," Wolf told her. "These things happen from time to time. There's not a great deal we can do about it." "I could have done something, father," she replied, looking off into the ruins. "But you wouldn't let me, remember?" "Do we have to go over that again, Paul?" Wolf asked him in a pained voice. "You have to learn to accept your losses. The West-side errands were doomed anyway. At best you'd only have been able to stall off the inevitable for a few months. We're not who we are and what we are in order to get mixed up in things that don't have any meaning." "So you said before." She looked around at the filmy trees marching away into the fog down the empty streets. "I didn't think the trees would come back so fast," she said with a strange little catch in her voice. "I thought they might have waited a little longer." "It's been almost 25 centuries, Paul." "Really? It seems like only just last year." "Don't brood about it. It'll only make you melancholy. Why don't we go inside? The fog's beginning to make us all a bit moody." Unaccountably, Aunt Paul put her arm about Garion's shoulders as they turned toward the tower. Her fragrance and the sense of her closeness brought a lump to his throat. The distance that had grown between them in the past few months seemed to vanish at their touch. The chamber in the base of the tower had been built of such massive stones that neither the passage of centuries nor the silent probing tendrils of tree roots had been able to dislodge them. Great shallow arches supported the low stone ceiling, making the room seem almost like a cave. At the end of the room, opposite the narrow doorway, a wide crack between two of the rough-hewn blocks provided a natural chimney. Dernick had soberly considered the crack the previous evening when they'd arrived, cold and wet, and then had quickly constructed a crude but efficient fireplace out of the rubble. "It'll serve," the smith had said. "Not very elegant, perhaps, but good enough for a few days." As Wolf, Garion, and Aunt Paul entered the low cave-like chamber, a good fire crackled in the fireplace, casting looming shadows among the low arches and radiating a welcome warmth. Dernick in his brown leather tunic was stacking firewood along the wall. Beric, huge red-bearded and mail-shirted, was polishing his sword. Silk in an unbleached linen shirt and black leather vest, lounged idly on one of the packs, toying with a pair of dice. Any sign of Hedar yet? Beric asked, looking up. It's a day or so early, Mr. Wolf replied, going to the fireplace to warm himself. Why don't you change your boots, Garion? Aunt Paul suggested, hanging her blue cloak on one of the pegs Dernick had hammered into a crack in the wall. Garion lifted his pack down from another peg and began rummaging through it. Your stockings, too, she added. Is the fog lifting at all? Silk asked Mr. Wolf. Not a chance. If I can persuade you all to move out from in front of the fire, I'll see about supper, Aunt Paul told them, suddenly very businesslike. She began setting out a ham, a few loaves of dark peasant bread, a sack of dried peas, and a dozen or so leathery-looking carrots, humming softly to herself as she always did when she was cooking. The next morning after breakfast, Garion pulled on a fleece-lined overvest, belted on his sword, and went back out into the fog-muffled ruins to watch for Hedar. It was a task to which he'd appointed himself, and he was grateful that none of his friends had seen fit to tell him that it wasn't really necessary. As he trudged through the slush-colored streets toward the broken west gate of the city, he made a conscious effort to avoid the melancholy brooding that had blackened the previous day. Since there was absolutely nothing he could do about his circumstances, chewing on them could only leave a sour taste in his mouth. He wasn't exactly cheerful when he reached the low piece of wall by the west gate, but he was not precisely gloomy either. The wall offered some protection, but the damp chill still crept through his clothes, and his feet were already cold. He shivered and settled down to wait. There was no point in trying to see any distance in the fog, so he concentrated on listening. His ears began to sort out the sounds in the forest beyond the wall, the drip of water from the trees, the occasional sodden thump of snow sliding from the limbs, and the tapping of a woodpecker working on a dead snag several hundred yards away. That's my cow, a wolf said. Not a wolf. That's my cow, a voice said suddenly from somewhere out in the fog. Garion froze and stood silently listening. Keep her in your own pasture, then, another voice replied shortly. Is that you, Lammer? The first voice asked. Right, you're Detton, aren't you? I didn't recognize you. How long's it been? 4 or 5 years, I suppose, Lammer judged. How are things going in your village? Detton asked. We're hungry. The taxes took all our food. Ours too. We've been eating boiled tree roots. We haven't tried that yet. We're eating our shoes. How's your wife? Detton said politely. She died last year, Lammer answered in a flat, unemotional voice. My lord took our son for a soldier, and he was killed in a battle somewhere. They poured boiling pitch on him. After that, my wife stopped eating. Didn't take her long to die. I'm sorry, Detton sympathized. She was very beautiful. And they're both better off, Lammer declared. They aren't cold or hungry anymore. Which kind of tree roots have you been eating? Birch is best, Detton told him. Spruce has too much pitch. The oak's too tough. You boil some grass with the roots to give them a bit of flavor. I'll have to try it. I've got to get back, Detton said. My lord's got me clearing trees and he'll have me flogged if I stay away too long. Maybe I'll see you again sometime. If we both live. Goodbye, Detton. Goodbye, Lammer. The two voices drifted away. Garion stood quite still for a long time after they were gone, his mind numb with shock, and with tears of sympathy standing in his eyes. The worst part of it was the matter-of-fact way in which the two had accepted it all. A terrible anger began to burn in his throat. He wanted suddenly to hit somebody. Then there was another sound far off in the fog. Somewhere in the forest nearby, someone was singing. The voice was a light, clear tenor, and Garion could hear it quite plainly as it drew closer. The song was filled with ancient wrongs, and the refrain was a call to battle. Irrationally, Garion's anger focused on the unknown singer. His vapid bawling about the abstract injustices seemed somehow obscene in the face of the quiet despair of Lammer and Detton. Without thinking, Garion drew his sword and crouched slightly behind the shattered wall. The song came yet nearer, and Garion could hear the step of the horse's hooves in the wet snow. Carefully, he poked his head out from behind the wall as the singer appeared out of the fog, no more than 20 paces away. He was a young man dressed in yellow hose and a bright red jerkin. His fur-lined cloak was tossed back, and he had a long curved bow slung over one shoulder and a well-sheathed sword on his opposite hip. His reddish-gold hair fell smoothly down his back from beneath a pointed cap, with a feather rising from it. Although his song was grim and he sang it in a voice throbbing with passion, there was about his youthful face a kind of friendly openness that no amount of scolding could erase. Garion glared at this empty-headed young nobleman, quite certain that the singing fool had never made a meal of tree roots or mourned the passing of a wife who had starved herself to death out of grief. The stranger turned his horse and, still singing, rode directly toward the broken arch of the gateway behind which Garion lurked in ambush. Garion was not normally a belligerent boy, and under other circumstances he might have approached the situation differently. The gaudy young stranger, however, had presented himself at precisely the wrong time. Garion's quickly devised plan had the advantage of simplicity. Since there was nothing to complicate it, it worked admirably, up to a point. No sooner had the lyric young man passed through the gate than Garion stepped from his hiding place, grabbed the back of the rider's cloak, and yanked him bodily out of the saddle. With a startled outcry and a wet splat, the stranger landed unceremoniously on his back in the slush at Garion's feet. The second part of Garion's plan, however, fell completely apart. Even as he moved in to take the fallen rider prisoner at sword point, the young man rolled, came to his feet, and drew his own sword, seemingly all in one motion. His eyes were snapping with anger, and his sword weaved threateningly. Garion was not a fencer, but his reflexes were good, and the chores he performed at Valdor's farm had hardened his muscles. Despite the anger which had moved him to attack in the first place, he had no real desire to hurt this young man. His opponent seemed to be holding his sword lightly, almost negligently, and Garion thought that a smart blow on the blade might very well knock it out of his hand. He swung quickly, but the blade flicked out of the path of the heavy swipe, and clashed with the steely ring down on his own sword. Garion jumped back and made another clumsy swing. The swords rang again. Then the air was filled with a clash and scrape and bell-like rattle as the two of them banged and parried and feinted with their blades. It took Garion only a moment to realize that his opponent was much, much better at this than he was, but that the young man had ignored several opportunities to strike at him. In spite of himself, he began to grin in the excitement of their noisy contest. The stranger's answering grin was open, even friendly. "All right, that's enough of that." It was Mr. Wolf. The old man was striding toward them with Barrack and Silk Cloak close on his heels. "Just exactly what do you two think you're doing?" Garion's opponent, after one startled glance, lowered his sword. "Belgariad," he began. "Lal Doron," Wolf's tone was scathing. "Have you lost what little sense you had to begin with?" Several things clicked into place in Garion's mind simultaneously, as Wolf turned on him coldly. "Well, Garion, would you like to explain this?" Garion instantly decided to try guile. "Grandfather," he said, stressing the word and giving the younger stranger a quick warning look, "you didn't think we were really fighting, did you? Lal Doron here was just showing me how you block somebody's sword when he attacks, that's all." "Really?" Wolf replied skeptically. "Of course," Garion said, all innocence now. "What possible reason could there be for us trying to hurt each other?" Lal Doron opened his mouth to speak, but Garion deliberately stepped on his foot. "Lal Doron's really very good," he rushed on, putting his hand in a friendly fashion on the young man's shoulder. "He taught me a lot in just a few minutes." "Let it stand." Silk's fingers flickered at him in the minute gestures of the Drasnian secret language. "Always keep a lie simple." "The lad's an apt pupil, Belgariad," Lal Doron said lamely, finally understanding. "He's agile, if nothing else," Mr. Wolf replied dryly. "What's the idea behind all the frippery?" He indicated Lal Doron's gaudy clothes. "You look like a maypole." "The Mimbraids have started detaining honest Asturians for questioning," the young errant explained, "and I had to pass several of their strongholds. I thought if I dressed like one of their toadies I wouldn't be bothered." "Maybe you've got better sense than I thought," Wolf conceded grudgingly. He turned to Silk and Barrack. "This is Lal Doron, son of the Baron of Wildanter. He'll be joining us." "I wanted to talk to you about that, Belgariad," Lal Doron put in quickly. "My father commanded me to come here and I can't disobey him, but I'm pledged in a matter of extremest urgency." "Every young nobleman in Asturia is pledged in at least 2 or 3 such matters of urgency," Wolf replied. "I'm sorry, Lal Doron, but the matter we're involved in is much too important to be postponed while you go out to ambush a couple of Mimbre tax collectors." Aunt Paul approached them out of the fog then, with Dernick striding protectively at her side. "What are they doing with the swords, father?" she demanded, her eyes flashing. "Playing," Mr. Wolf replied shortly. "Or so they say. This is Lal Doron. I think I've mentioned him to you." Aunt Paul looked Lal Doron up and down with one raised eyebrow. "Very colorful young man." "The clothes are a disguise," Wolf explained. "He's not as frivolous as all that. Not quite, anyway. He's the best bowman in Asturia, and we might need his skill before we're done with all this." "I see," she said, somewhat unconvinced. "There's another reason, of course," Wolf continued, "but I don't think we need to get into that just now, do we?" "Are you still worried about that passage, father?" she asked with exasperation. "The Marine Codex is very obscure, and none of the other versions say anything at all about the people it mentions. It could be pure allegory, you know." "I've seen a few too many allegories turn out to be plain fact to start gambling at this point. Why don't we all go back to the tower," he suggested. "It's a bit cold and wet out here for lengthy debates on textual variations." Garion glanced at Silk, baffled by this exchange, but the little man returned his look with blank incomprehension. "Will you help me catch my horse, Garion?" Lal Doron asked politely, sheathing his sword. "Of course," Garion replied, also putting away his weapon. "I think it went that way." Lal Doron picked up his bow, and the two of them followed the horse's tracks off into the ruins. "I'm sorry I pulled you off your horse," Garion apologized when they were out of sight of the others. "No matter," Lal Doron laughed easily. "I should have been paying more attention." He looked quizzically at Garion. "Why did you lie to Belgariad?" "Wasn't exactly a lie," Garion replied. "We weren't really trying to hurt each other, and sometimes it takes hours trying to explain something like that." Lal Doron laughed again, an infectious sort of laugh. In spite of him, Garion couldn't help but join in. Both laughing, they continued together down an overgrown street, between the low mounds of slush-covered rubble. Well, that ends the prologue in the first chapter. I think that I'm going to call it there, as my voice is starting to get really tired. You can tell that I'm getting a little bit vocally fatigued by the number of mistakes that I make. There are a lot of places in these books where the way that he puts together the words can get a little tongue-twistery when you say them out loud, and the longer I've been at it, the more prone I am to stumble over those. So I think it's about time to call it, but we will continue again. Probably not a lot this week. I've got a bunch of other stuff on my plate. There's a patron-only music session happening later in the week, and I've got a couple of other things that need doing this week. But we will continue on next time with Chapter 2 of Queen of Sorcery. I hope you've enjoyed it so far, and hope to see you again soon. I'll have a good night.